All right. Perfect. All right, so welcome everyone to Belmont Neighbors Against Racism. Welcome to any new attendees. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Just a heads up, we just started recording, so we will be showing tonight's meeting for future use. Before we get started, we usually take this time to reflect on the organizing that we've done outside of Belmont Neighbors Against Racism, but I would like to switch it up tonight and just have you put in the chat one concrete thing you're planning to do this week to practice self-care. So as everybody probably already knows, the Derek Chauvin sentencing is taking place this Friday. So it's crucial that I think we all are being gentle and kind with ourselves, no matter the outcome. And then while everybody's doing that, I just wanted to go over our guiding principles of the group. So we live in the community we want to create. Oppression exists, but not in this space. We're hard on issues and soft on people. We speak only for ourselves. We're committed to compassionate listening. We center voices of Black neighbors and people of color. If you're comfortable speaking, practice more listening. If you're comfortable listening, practice more speaking. And we are neighbors, so we assume the best intentions with respect and positive regard. And I just want to remind everyone to please mute your mic starting now, and make sure you stay on mute throughout the meeting. But if any questions come up, please put them in the chat for our guests to address at the end of the presentation. So again, thank you so much for all being here, and I will turn it over to Debbie to introduce our guest for the evening.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. So appreciate it. Thank you, Victoria. I'm really excited to welcome Sergeant Carl Tennenbaum. He's a native San Franciscan, grew up in the late 60s, attended University of San Francisco's public administration program and San Francisco Law School with a focus on constitutional law, joined the San Francisco Police Department in 1981. He said it's a fulfillment of a lifelong dream. Over 32 years, he's worked in a variety of areas, field training officer, undercover narcotics, robbery abatement team, public school liaison, critical incident team, hostage negotiator, evidence control. He was promoted in 1996 to the rank of sergeant, where he was assigned as a commander of the San Francisco Housing Authority community policing team. So this team had responsibility for oversight of all aspects of life within thousands of public housing property units located around San Francisco. It was during this 3-year tenure in the narcotics unit in the midst of the 1980s crack epidemic that Carl saw the futility of drug prohibition and narcotics enforcement. And this was a turning point for Carl. Since retirement, Carl has been involved with the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is a nonprofit of police, prosecutors, judges, corrections officials, and other law enforcement officials advocating for criminal justice and drug policy reforms that will make our communities safe and just. The Law Enforcement Action Partnership's mission is to unite and mobilize the voice of law enforcement in support of drug policy and criminal justice reforms that will make communities safer by focusing law enforcement resources on, or refocusing their resources on, alternatives to arrest and incarceration, addressing the root causes of crime, and working towards healing community relations. Carl's daughter is a deputy city attorney in Petaluma, and his son also is a member of the San Francisco Police Department. And we just learned that Carl is planning on a run for sheriff in Sonoma County. So we're excited to welcome him. Thank you so much.
I thank you. You make that sound a lot more impressive than I feel like it is, but thank you for your flattering words. Now I'm going to switch screens. I hope you can all see me. Just let me know. Can you still see me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm just going to start. I'm going to go into the presentation, and then I'm really looking forward to questions anybody has afterwards. I want to thank you again for inviting me here this evening to speak on a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and that's public safety and the community responder model of 911 responses. As you heard, my name is Carl Tennenbaum, and I'm retired San Francisco Police Sergeant and now a member of LEAP. I'm here to discuss how establishing a new branch of civilian first responders for police calls for service can help reduce over-reliance on the police that will ultimately result in more positive outcomes for our communities. I will talk about the general idea and the details of the community responder approach to non-criminal issues in a minute. But first, I want to share a couple of anecdotes that show how this issue is personal to me and how it affects all officers and deputies and what they experience firsthand on a daily basis. I'm going to dedicate this first story to Roy. 20 years ago, I was a sergeant walking a footbeat in the North Beach neighborhood of San Francisco, where I had recently been transferred. As I exited Cafe Trieste, a local coffee shop and San Francisco landmark, I saw a handsome, dapper man in his mid-60s walking towards me. He appeared to be somewhat agitated, gesturing with his arms wildly and muttering incoherently under his breath. I sensed that something was wrong, so I approached him to talk. I tried to initiate a conversation with Roy, at which point he got very animated and started yelling at me, telling me that I didn't have any right to talk to him, amongst other things. His profanity-laced yelling and animated aggressive gestures caught me off guard. And to be honest, I was afraid he might get violent with me. Yet I remained calm and allowed him to rant until he calmed down, at which point I was confident that he was not a threat to me or anybody else. And so I went about my business. North Beach is a dense tourist-rich neighborhood where the merchants and residents are in constant contact and share endless amounts of information with each other. Shortly after my encounter with Roy, I learned from other officers and members of the community that Roy was one of the regulars, meaning that he was a fixture in the neighborhood and that he had serious untreated mental health issues, primarily schizophrenia and paranoia. Over the course of the next 13 years, until I retired, I would encounter Roy on an almost daily basis. Oftentimes, he could be heard before he was seen, walking down the middle of Columbus Avenue, yelling and ranting at the top of his lungs. Needless to say, we received countless 911 calls reporting a crazy person screaming and yelling and scaring people. Fortunately, most of the officers knew Roy and knew that he was not a direct threat to anyone's safety. Eventually, Roy and I became friends. I learned what triggered him and that he really just needed someone to talk to, as so many people do out there, as so many people who call 911. They want to talk to somebody, not even for an answer, but just to talk. I was very fortunate in the sense that I received extensive training through the police department as a member of the crisis intervention team and as a hostage negotiator, which enhanced my communications and active listening skills. Yet those were specialized blocks of training that I had to request and that weren't available to all officers. Roy is just one of hundreds of people with untreated mental health issues in San Francisco. The good news is that most officers receive some training and are usually compassionate enough to handle most individuals like Roy nonviolently. The not so good news is that people like Roy need mental health intervention and long-term treatment, something that most officers are not equipped to deal with. Now I want to tell you about Barbara and Louie. Barbara and Louie were two chronic alcoholics who lived in various doorways in North Beach. And I'm going to digress here for a second. I tell two stories about North Beach, and yet I worked in every part of the city. And the story it's the same no matter where you go, the Bayview Hunters Point or the Mission. There's no level of danger or threat that's greater than it is. I mean, North Beach, they're all pretty innocuous. So Barbara and Louie. Barbara preferred sleeping at the Wells Fargo Bank, while Louie preferred the entryway of a local nightclub. Every day, like clockwork, we would receive a 911 call from the employees of the Wells Fargo Bank or from the nightclub telling us that there was an unconscious person in their doorway. And every day, one of the officers from Central Station would go to the location, try to rouse either Barbara or Louie, and then stand by for the paramedics to arrive to medically clear either one or both of them. If Barbara or Louie were medically cleared by the paramedics, the officer that would then transport them to the county jail, where Barbara or Louie would be booked for a public drunkenness violation, thus tying up additional officers and deputies. This scenario with Barbara continued for years. The responding officer realized that Barbara had passed away in the very same doorway that we had found her intoxicated in on so many occasions. Louie eventually got into treatment and spent the last few years of his life sober and not living in a doorway. Again, these were not criminal situations, yet we had at least one officer tied up for hours every day dealing with a person who had a substance abuse issue. The police, based on their overall training with the emphasis on voice commands and the use of force as a solution, as well as being tasked with myriad other aspects of law enforcement and criminal investigations, are not the appropriate first responders to deal with the Roys, Barbaras, and Louis of the world. Now I'm going to speak directly about the community responder model and how it works. A recent extensive study of 5 major American cities conducted by one of my colleagues at LEAP, along with the Center for American Progress, revealed that, on average, approximately 40% of all 911 calls are classified as low-level calls for service. In addition to the calls for people who are intoxicated or experiencing mental health issues like Roy, Barbara, and Louie, many of the calls are for the quality of life issues like noise complaints, loitering, juvenile issues, car alarms, barking dogs. The list goes on, but all involving non-violent, non-life-threatening incidents. So I'm going to tell you a little bit how do community responders work. The basic mechanics of the community responder program works like this. When a person calls 911, the call taker sees that it's a low-risk type of call and screens it for weapons, violence, or medical emergencies. Those notes go to the dispatcher, who, instead of dispatching a police car, dispatches a civilian team specially trained and equipped to handle those calls. We have identified 2 main categories of calls that would be appropriate for non-police responders. The first category would have community responders dispatched to lower risk 911 calls related to mental health, addiction, and homelessness. These calls for service are often coded as miscellaneous disturbances, wellness checks, intoxicated persons, or mental health crises. The ideal responders are social workers, peer navigators, paramedics, and clinicians. Eugene, Oregon, Denver, Colorado, Olympia, Washington, San Francisco, Santa Rosa, and Petaluma are just a few of the cities currently transitioning to or fully integrated with some version of the community responder model. A second category of 911 calls delegated to the community responder would be calls for service related to quality of life issues and low priority conflicts that aren't related to behavioral health issues and that don't involve an immediate threat to the public safety. These might be coded as neighbor disputes, juvenile disturbances, suspicious persons, noise complaints, miscellaneous disturbances, or trespassing. The ideal responders are people with credibility in the community and experience and training in mediation and de-escalating conflict. Now, the one big question that comes up whenever I make this presentation is community responder safety. And it's also an issue that's brought up by law enforcement who wants to protect their interests. And I understand this, although I don't agree with it. One of the first reactions people have is, isn't it too dangerous to send an unarmed civilians to police calls for service? I'm going to provide you with some statistics regarding calls for service in cities where the community responder model is working, but I want to tell you that in 32 years, as an active and busy police officer handling thousands of calls for service, I rarely ever had to use force or encountered violent resistance. In Eugene, Oregon, the CAHOOTS program has been operating for 30 years and never had a single casualty or injury or even a close call for a civilian responder. Olympia, Washington, and Denver, Colorado have been operating their programs for less time, but they've had 0 safety issues as well. Why? It is often the law enforcement officer in the uniform and the badge, coupled with his or her lack of experience and training, that may escalate a situation. Also, police officers are trained and conditioned to use force as the fallback method of control when dealing with any subject, and officers often overreact to the situation. I personally always approach situations like it was me, Carl Tennenbaum, forgetting that it was a uniform. And when people resisted me or weren't as cooperative or compliant, and I realized that it was the authority figure that I was presenting that they didn't like or respond to, not to mention underlying PTSD issues, any other number of things that I had to learn wasn't personal to me. It was the uniform and my position. Community responders are professionally trained to assess, analyze, and connect with individuals in crisis to manage situations. If a situation is different than expected, or if it escalates, community responders can always step back and summon the police via radio communication. Still, fewer than 1% of the calls in Eugene get referred to police, and Denver has been operating for over 6 months without calling the police and backup for a single time. I want to talk a little bit about the number of calls that are handled by community responders. LEAP compiled police calls for service data from 8 cities and surveyed LEAP police members, myself included, to estimate how useful community responders would be and what percentage of those 911 calls for service do we think the community responders could handle. We estimate that between 20 and 37% of all police calls for service could be handled by community responders with no armed police response. I personally feel that number is conservative. That works out to between a quarter and a third of all calls for service, which is tens of thousands of calls per year and millions of dollars in patrol time. I'm going to dive into the details of existing community responder models for a few minutes on how appropriate 911 calls are safely diverted to the community responders. First, how a call is identified as appropriate for community responders. And second, how community responders are dispatched for those calls, how the calls are identified. In most cities, 911 calls go to the call taker sitting in the middle of the emergency call center, with police dispatch on one side and fire and EMS dispatch on the other. The call taker enters notes in the call file as they talk to the person, and the call file sits in the police dispatch queue according to its priority level. Police dispatchers radio the patrol units to handle the highest priority calls whenever the unit becomes available. Lower priority calls usually sit in the dispatch queue for quite a while, at least 15 minutes, but often hours. In Eugene, Olympia, and Denver, the 911 call takers are trained to gather the information needed to determine if calls could be handled by community responders. There's usually a list of call types where the default is to send the community responders, like welfare checks or to assist the public. And the call taker needs to ensure that there aren't any red flags like weapons or serious injuries. For other call types like intoxicated persons, community responders might not be the default, but if there aren't any red flags, they can still be sent. In other types of calls like trespassing or someone threatening to commit suicide, community responders can be sent if the caller requests them. Every city has modified their particular community responder program to fit their needs. In Eugene, the community responders handles transport requests, suicidal issues, and death notifications. In Denver, they do a lot of trespassing or unwanted person calls, suicidal persons, disturbances, and indecent exposure calls. Those calls sit in the dispatch queue due to their lower priority status, and when the community responders become available, the police dispatchers radio out the next call to them just like they'd radio out a patrol car. The calls keep sitting in the dispatch queue until either the community responders become available, or if community responders are too backed up and the police are available, the dispatcher may send the police. In Olympia and Denver, there's also a direct line that people can call to indicate that they specifically want to reach the community responders and not the police. In San Francisco, the community responder program is run by the fire department. That's different in terms of identifying calls to divert because call takers send the calls for community responders to fire dispatch directly instead of police dispatch. So for now, they're only identifying calls related to lower priority mental health crises calls. However, they get approximately 16,000 mental health related calls per year. So that's plenty to start with. The last thing I'm going to talk about, and this is more, we call this administrative alternatives. And this would be 10 to 20% of the calls, in addition to the numbers that I just told you, that don't need an armed officer or community responder, just some type of administrative solution. These would be calls strictly for reports only. These would include car accidents with no injuries or thefts or vandalism with no suspect. Calls in this category can be handled by online or phone reporting or directing people to come into the station if they so desire. I want to thank you very much for allowing me to make this presentation and tell you that LEAP is actively in keeping this conversation going and wants to work with any community who's interested in developing a community responder program nationwide. I will be happy to answer any questions you might have regarding the community responder program. Thank you. Questions?
Victoria, did you want to, I was thinking that we would ask folks to put their questions in the chat and maybe you read them, Victoria, is that okay? Yeah,
I can absolutely do that. First question for you, Carl. What do you think makes you different from your police peers since you were all trained and conditioned to use force? And then follow up, how were you able to rise above the conditioning?
What makes things different as opposed to when I was doing it?
Just your perspective. How does your perspective differ from maybe your other peers that had that conditioning?
The easy answer is my personality. The more difficult answer is that in 1981, when I joined the police department, we were just, it was sort of in the Reagan years were just winding up. And I think anybody who's a student of American history knows that, the clearing out of the mental health hospitals, a reduction of social services, all of the trickle down economics, I'll save the rest of it. And then in the mid 80s, when I got transferred to the narcotics unit, the crack epidemic came, and that impacted a lot of people, not only directly because of the use and the abuse, but also that's when the war on drugs really, really escalated. And it really marginalized huge segments of the population that weren't affected or impacted before. That coupled with, these are all talking points now, but, I saw the transition from, I was a beat cop and I walked the beat. And, when I left in the last few years, watching what's gone on nationwide, you look at the militarization coupled with the higher demands for service. And, the average police officer is just, they're overwhelmed with having to multitask and do so many different things and never becoming really good at any one of them, especially the police officer on the street. So I just think it's a combination and confluence of all those factors, but it's really the police officers they're not equipped to deal with so many of these quality of life and social issues.
Thank you so much for answering that. And Trina, you had your hand raised. Did you want to chime in or?
Well, I had my hand raised, but then I put it in the chat.
Oh, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, Carl. Thank you for your presentation. It's very, very interesting. So my first question is, how did you come to the mindset where you didn't see interactions with people you were dealing with as personal? Because oftentimes it appears that police officers take what is happening as personal, which can of course lead to really negative outcomes. So I'm just wondering how you kind of came to that mindset to know, this isn't about me, this is not personal.
It is such a great question. It's a real double-edged sword, because like what I was telling in my story about, coming up to people in uniform. And I can remember the best case scenario for me is being when we had crowd control situations and you're wearing the helmet, you've got the big baton or the billy club, whatever you want to call it. And people are taunting and yelling at you. And I'm thinking, these people know that I'm a really good guy and I don't want to do anything to them. But again, it's the uniform that, the presence. However, the interesting, the dance that's hard to do is connecting with people on a personal basis and trying to have them relate to you personally, but then not taking it personally when somebody doesn't do that. And especially when I was in groups or cultures that weren't native to me, and people didn't, accept me or respect me for the person that I was because of cultural differences or because of issues with the police. So it's finding that balance and not taking it personally, and that's why cops start to depersonalize people, because they don't want it to affect them. They don't want to be able to relate and take it personally and hear that maybe what they're doing isn't right. So I don't know if that answers your question, Trina, but that's how I approached it.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you.
The next question is from Wade, and the question is, who receives the initial 911 call and how were they routed between police and fire?
So every dispatch center, like I said, there's just one call taker. Well, actually, I take that back. There's usually a designated call taker for police, and then there's one for fire and rescue. So that's the person that takes the call, and then they delegate it out to the particular police unit or to the fire unit, and that's pretty the simple answer to that.
Great.
Well, can I jump in? Because the reason I'm asking the question, Carl, is that one problem we often have with talking about a citizen responder unit is how would that get routed? And so the argument is that it's just too complicated to train this 911 person who routes police fire to have a third thing to route to. So, we have a very small police dispatch here in Belmont. Other calls, if you're in the county, the call would go to the county. They have a big dispatch facility. How does that work depending on the size of your location?
I think that, first of all, the one thing you said is too complicated, which I understand, but I just feel like, I was thinking about that today. I'm from an era before 911. And so to create and incorporate 911 as a call system was very complicated. Just like it used to be that you call for an ambulance, or you call for a fire truck, or you call for a police officer. And over time, we realized that there were more firemen, and we started training them. But to answer your question, Wade, it is complicated, but it's also just training the call taker and having people that are competent in the skill set to be able to triage calls, and to know, number one, how to delegate them, and also how to get the information when they're talking to the person on the phone. There are a lot of emergencies that need an immediate response, but again, the numbers that I put out there, there's much more time than I think we realize to triage these calls and to prioritize them. And I think it's going to be complicated as we transition to a new model and create a whole new response team, community responders. But it's something that has to be done. So the challenges are there, but it's a matter of training. It's also a matter of incentivizing people that come for the job. I had an experience recently where I was looking at being a dispatcher several years ago, and I went to some training that was police academy related, and it really, they're still kind of trying to hire the same people as opposed to training and encouraging more broad-minded people to do it. So I think it's just hiring the right people and training the right people, and realizing that you may have to divide the services, take the fire dispatcher or the police dispatcher, and either give them somebody to work with them, or train that person to be better at delegating and dispatching the calls.
Great. Next question is from Michelle. How do we overcome police or city council resistance based on the claim that they need to protect responders, especially when they want to send police along with any mental health responders?
I can only tell you the presentation that I just made. It's just, and my own personal experience, it's not, that's not the reality. The numbers don't support that theory, and my own personal experience doesn't support that theory. I tell people, and I can be somewhat flippant about it, it's not that dangerous out there. It's not. Trust me, there are public safety issues, there are crimes of violence that, we're seeing an uptick now, which we won't touch on that, but overall, and again, like I said, a lot of times that police officer can create more, can escalate the situation just by their presence.
And then I think, Pat, you had your hand raised, and I know you want to clarify a part of Michelle's question. Did you want to chime in?
Yes, what I was going to say is that the county sheriff is an old school guy that thinks absolutely everything we do needs a gunman around to protect us. To hinted at by Wade earlier, all of the, or most, at least Redwood City and the county sheriff's dispatchers are CIT trained. Fact is, they only have two things on the menu: A, police, B, firemen. And that's it. Clinician without a cop is not on their menu at all. And this county and its incorporated cities insist, despite all the evidence, that mental health clinicians, A, are too afraid to go on calls. Now, they said on their own. Now, I can see why they would may fear going on their own, because in San Francisco and in Eugene, they don't go by themselves, they go with an EMT. But B, every mental health person in crisis is, quoting a police chief of Redwood City, is a suspect of experiencing a mental health crisis. Therefore, the scene must be controlled and locked down before we dare let a clinician approach that person in crisis. And that's how they roll. And that's what me, who's been in marketing and familiar with A/B testing, they don't even A/B test. They test A to see if it works well enough. And then sometime unspecified down the road, they'll try B, a mental health clinician by themselves. So that's what we're dealing with here. And it seems that no amount of evidence about Eugene or Denver or anywhere else is gonna have these police departments say, oh, I understand I'm completely incompetent at this job, but I'm still gonna do it. Thanks. That's a question and a statement and an environment that you need to fully understand, I think.
Pat, trust me, I fully understand the environment. I lived it for 32 years, and I know I was, I don't want to say I was a good old boy, but I came up through the system and I experienced it firsthand. And the one, without answering your question directly, the one thing I will tell you, the one word that you put out there when you were just talking was control. And that's what it's all about. It's about the sheriff or the chief of police or whatever political person is in charge wanting to maintain their control, and whether it's control of the the budget, or it's control of staffing, it's control of the jurisdiction. But the other control issue, which I find very I don't know if it's ironic is the word, but any of you, I challenge you, the next time you're having a dispute with your significant other, try to control the situation. Tell that person to be quiet. Tell them to sit down, to snap out of it. There's an old saying, something about with flies and honey and flies and vinegar. I'm not sure how it goes, but and I'm not trying to be a wise guy, but Pat, those are really good points, because that's what we're up against. That's what we're up against here in Sonoma County. There's a real there's a problem, and there's a problem nationwide. And until we rise up, until people, there's a groundswell of support to say this is not working. And again, getting back to what happened in Half Moon Bay last year, what's happened up here, San Francisco's had some bad incidents. At what point do we say enough is enough? So that's not an answer, Pat, but that's my view on the control issue.
There's another question from Trina here. How can police officers be trained to not see the mentally ill as criminal threats, even if there may be a weapon present?
That's a tough one, and I think it's I think they try and they want to, but again, it's like the training that I took to be a crisis intervention officer. It's a 40-hour block of instruction, and so you're going to take a police officer that's been doing the same job for 15 years the same way, and he or she is going to some compulsory training. It's a real hard one to do. So we have to. I use the term, we have to build a better police officer. They need to get more training starting from day one in the academy, de-emphasizing their control issues and the weapon issues. And now, again, everything that I've talked about today, if there's a person, with a gun and a hostage, a real critical incident, then you don't have the luxury of sending in a clinician first or a therapist first. You want to stabilize the situation. However, once the situation stabilized, that's when you have to sort of tone it down, and that's when the negotiator or the clinical person comes in. And unfortunately, there are times that there's no there's no other solution except for the officer to use force. But it's just not that frequent, but it's understandable that that's the way. And again, it's the police mindset. And it's also remembering that that's what they're trained to do. It's they revert to force and control. Every single tool that a police officer has ultimately is about, with the exception of their notepad, it's all about, controlling the situation. And it's a weapon or it's handcuffs. So in a situation that's a severe crisis where lives are in danger, then I understand that. But it's just building a better police officer, training, hiring and training.
We have a question from Patricia. What do you believe are the first steps to getting this in San Mateo? Barriers are so far. BOS said social workers don't feel comfortable going on their own, but she doesn't believe this is true. And funding.
It's what we're doing here. It's just building a coalition to get the word out, and you don't want to have another bad incident that's going to force the issue. Unfortunately, that's oftentimes what it takes. It's Sonoma County. We're dealing with a lot of really big financial payouts that have gotten the conversation going. And that's how we got civilian oversight, and we've increased civilian oversight. So notwithstanding something major, it's just going to take a groundswell of support and a lot of lobbying and a lot more people like me and organizations like LEAP and the many other organizations out there that are pushing for this. And the fact that it is happening nationwide, it's happening in the Bay Area. And sooner or later, these law enforcement agencies are going to have to acknowledge that something's got to change.
Thank you. This question's from Bill. What has been your experience with other county sheriff offices with the presentation you have given us tonight regarding the use of community responders as alternatives to police?
I haven't gotten any feedback directly from any other law enforcement agencies. Last week in Half Moon Bay, there was a sheriff's captain who was at the meeting, but he didn't engage me. We didn't have any discussion. So I haven't gotten any feedback. I know what the general feeling is, and it's not supportive. But again, that's going back to the control issue.
Elsa asks, do the police and SF appreciate this change LEAP has enabled for them and their jobs?
I'm gonna get all homey about this. I like to tell people that I was fortunate to grow up in an amazing city and to work for a really progressive police department, where the officers are from as long as I can remember really are trained to be more considerate and open-minded. That being said, culturally, San Francisco is like a lot of other agencies. So I'm going to say yes, for the most part, the police in San Francisco do accept this, and most of them embrace it, but there's still internal pushback and there's a lot of inertia in law enforcement anyway. But yes, generally San Francisco police officers are the best.
Great. Patricia asks, any idea how much it would cost to start a pilot based on San Francisco's program? Population is different, but a ballpark.
I money and finances or not, I don't know. I don't have any answer for that.
Great. And then Debbie asks, do you have any thoughts about the 988 system and how can we encourage California to fund it sufficiently?
I'm not familiar with the 988 system.
Okay, Debbie, you can chime in there.
Okay, I'll chime in. Sure, this is a state law that it's still in committee, but it's still in play. And there is a 988 national number that you can call for mental health services, as opposed to armed policing. And this California law would fund it and make that available or make it mandatory for communities to have that option when they have a person who is, behaving as you have indicated, with mental health or substance abuse issues. You could call 988 and a non-police response would be mandatory. So that is a 988 is it's like 911, but it's for, that type of specific behavioral health emergency.
So if the question is, how do I feel about it? It should be apparent that I'm about 1,000,000% behind it. And it's also funny when I think in terms of what needs to change in Sonoma County and basically nationwide. San Francisco has 311, which is basically everything that's like public works type issues, all of the miscellaneous city issues that people have. New York has 311, which is really fascinating when you think about New York. But I also have thought about there should be another number that, well, now I know it's 988. So bravo. I'm sorry I didn't know about that, but that's great.
The other thing I just want to say really quickly is that we invited the Belmont Chief of Police, Tony Passalia. We invited every city council member and reached out to them. And I don't see them here. So that's all I can say. So it is an uphill climb.
Yeah, it's change often scares people, and especially when it's something dealing with public safety. And because we live in a culture that's, I think generally there's a lot of fear out there, and then we've had a lot of fear mongering going on for the past few years. And people, I know change has to come, and public safety is always first and foremost for everybody, for all of us. But I'm just going to go back to what I said. It's just, things are not that bad out there. I have friends who still live in San Francisco, and they tell me how bad the city is. And I go to the city, and it's, the Tenderloin's still the Tenderloin. These neighborhoods are still there, but there's a lot of good stuff going on. So yeah, it's the resistance to change that I don't understand.
And Jackie's question is kind of related here. And then Erica, I see your hand raised. You can ask your question after this, but any suggestions for how to find a sheriff and a DA candidate who will support the community responder transformation?
I don't, I think the best thing you could do, and I know a number of retired high-ranking police executives from San Francisco and nationwide. There's a whole government jobs website out there, and a lot of high-ranking administrators, when they get ready to retire, they go for these other high-ranking chiefs jobs around the country. I think if you put a job announcement out there somehow through the channels, you would get interested parties and a lot of progressive people. I worked with some really open-minded, forward-thinking executives who are my generation, who are now retired, that would actively be interested in a job like that. And I'm not speaking just for my people, but just in general. You put out a job search and say, this is what we want to do. We want a progressive sheriff who's going to embrace some new ideas, who's not going to resist the same old, and is going to realize that the community is everybody. It's just not all the, the well-heeled taxpayers that are funding our, whatever the budget is every year. So yeah, it's somehow just a big job search, go through a big job search company. And that's the best I can do there.
Great. And Erica, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to just a quick comment. I've heard us dancing around stuff tonight, but I want to call out racism here as a big influencer not to put a program like this together. That I think the element of control is a large part keeping white people in control, the white system in control, and that it is bad out there for people who are not white. But the white people in power don't see it as bad. And so therefore they're not interested in making changes. So we're all kind of saying it, but we're not saying it. So I just wanted to name it.
God love you, Erica. I'm glad you said it because it's so true. And when I was talking about my experience, I spent 3 years in narcotics in the mid 80s. And I look back now and it makes me sad. And I've never been more about reparations than I am in my life, because I think of all the injustice and all the lives that have been damaged. But what I did personally, and I was never a guy that I'm just doing my job, but I look back and go, that job was wrong. It was just wrong. So thank you for saying that, Erica. Thank you for opening the door and letting the elephant out.
And we have a question from Becca here. What motivated you to be a police officer, and what do you believe motivates most?
How much time do we have? What motivated me? Yeah, I was a kid that grew up in the 60s and the 70s. So you turn on the TV, or just every kid growing up when I was a macho white kid, you want to be a cowboy, you want to be a cop. That's my simple answer. And then growing up in the city, my dad was a big, he respected law enforcement, and he taught me to respect law enforcement. And then he had a lot of friends who were police officers, and I looked up to them and I admired them, just because of, the image that was being projected, and, on TV and in the movies and in my own personal life. And the funny thing is, I didn't follow the path to be a cop. In fact, if anything, I was one of those guys that was running the streets. But that was sort of my motivation, was just I wanted to do it. And then the opportunity came around, and I applied for it. And it was a dream come true when I became a cop. And when I retired after 32 years, I saw a lot and I dealt with a lot, and I'll spare you all the personal details, but I can look back on my career and just think it was amazing. And I tell people then, and I'll tell you now, I loved my job. I do. And I think law enforcement has damaged its own reputation and damaged itself. But I just grew up wanting to be a cop, and I just thought it was a cool thing to do. And it was a cool thing to do.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about police control tonight, but just in your perspective, this is from Bill, how do we address the issue of police control, and how do we begin to break down the barriers of fear and develop trust and support?
I can't say it enough, and I don't want to oversimplify it. It's creating incentives to hire a sort of a new breed of person, a new breed of police officer who's brought in. Basically, you're looking, somebody who's educated, who's worldly, and if you can't find that person, you teach them. They talk about police training, and I always get stuck on, I'm a dog guy and I train my dogs, but we don't, they don't teach police officers critical thinking. So it starts with hiring, and then it starts with the teaching, more of a college level type of instructional process, and then it's just taking that out there into the community and rebuilding the trust. And if we went to the more of a community responder model, it would take police out of those situations that they either escalate or don't know how to handle, and that have bad outcomes. So it's a combination of all of the above, but primarily it's hiring and training and just developing a new model.
Thank you. And I know that we are running short on time, and I know that there are other questions out there definitely waiting to be asked. So would you be open to maybe sharing your email with us, or maybe we can send it to the group and we can contact you kind of on a personal basis with our questions?
I am going to type my email into the chat box right now, and I
Amazing.
would love to hear from anybody who's interested in hearing more of what I have to say. Let me see. And there you have it. And spread it far and wide. I'm not worried about Big Brother or anybody coming after me. I'm not paranoid. And yeah, anybody wants my email or wants to talk to me, and I can always be reached through LEAP too.
Awesome. And can you restate for the group what your future plans are? What's coming up for you next? What's exciting about your future?
June 4th of 2022, there's an election in Sonoma County for sheriff. And I am going to I'm running for sheriff and want to be the sheriff of Sonoma County, and hopefully bring these changes up here.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time tonight. I know I'm speaking on behalf of the group. We all appreciate you being here. Thanks to all of our newcomers tonight for joining Belmont Neighbors Against Racism. I see we have a couple people. Oh, can you stay? Elsa says we want to change our sheriff too. So thank you all so much. Debbie, did you have any other, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I was reading, from the LEAP website, and, if you could just say a little bit about, LEAP's vision of sort of like addressing the core reasons for, the reasons for violence in our society, or the social problems that we're encountering.
So I joined LEAP 6 years ago, and when I joined LEAP, originally was Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. That was what the acronym was for. And that was because primarily police officers, basically people in the judicial system, judges, probation officers, police officers, people like me who realized even at the time how futile and detrimental and harmful the war on drugs was. So that was our primary platform. But then as things kept unfolding, and again, this is going back 5-6 years ago, with all of the civil rights issues, with all the police abuses, with all of the, I can recite every single name for you that, and I cringe and get teary-eyed thinking about every Sandra Bland or Breonna Taylor. It just, the list is endless. So that's when LEAP sort of transitioned to the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And I'm very proud to be a member because I've seen them grow exponentially and get the message out there. And this is a good example of how much impact they're having globally. I mean, there's a LEAP in the in Great Britain. It's a worldwide organization. So we just realized, based on our experiences in the criminal justice system, that the system is, I don't know if it's broken, but it's kind of limping along pretty badly. And we've decided to build a coalition to get the word out and to try and make some changes.
Great.
Well, for the good of the order, if that is everything, again, thank you all so much for being here. I'm actually going to put my email in the chat. If you want to join our email list and then maybe come to some of our other meetings, feel free to send me an email and I can get you on that list. But thank you all so much for coming. And thank you so much, Carl. It's been so great to have you and to hear your stories. And it's just been such a great evening. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
I also wanted to add that I will put this recording up on YouTube. And so when we send out, we'll probably send out a follow-up email, and then you can all feel free to share this widely with your friends and family and constituents. And Carl, I'm sure I can speak for many of us here that we wish you the best of luck, and please let us know how we can support your campaign.
Thank you. And conversely, I was active last year. I don't talk about my police career, but I was active with civilian oversight in San Francisco. And I was on a committee up here last year. So we've increased our civilian oversight. So if you need any pointers or insight or contacts, I'll give you. I have limited knowledge, but I was on a committee and I can point you in the right direction. But I'm a huge fan. It has to happen. So thank you very much, everybody. I just feeling the love. Thanks a lot.
Great.
So uplifting. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Ooh, fantastic. Wow.